Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Golden State Killer, a phantom who terrorized California for over a decade, leaving a trail of burglaries, rapes, and murders. For 40 years, he remained a ghost in the shadows. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. This case explores the blurred lines between truth and deception in the digital age. The narrator should maintain a tone of professional skepticism throughout, treating each revelation as another layer of a complex web of lies. Pay particular attention to the psychological elements, the motivations behind elaborate deceptions, and the human tendency to believe extraordinary stories. Use pauses effectively to allow listeners to process the mounting contradictions and red flags that emerge throughout the investigation. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world settles into its deepest sleep, we often find ourselves confronting the most unsettling truths about human nature. Tonight, we journey into a labyrinth of deception so intricate, so carefully constructed, that it challenges our very understanding of what constitutes reality in our modern, interconnected world. This is a story that begins with what appears to be an extraordinary tale of survival, a man claiming to have endured unimaginable horrors at the hands of Mexican cartels, forced to compete in deadly tournaments for his very life. But as we peel back the layers of this narrative, we discover something far more complex and disturbing than any cartel violence could ever be. We live in an age where stories spread across the globe in seconds, where extraordinary claims can capture headlines and hearts before anyone has time to verify their truth. This is the story of how one man's elaborate web of lies nearly became a Hollywood film, and how a journalist's investigation revealed a network of fraud that stretched from Mexico City to international NGOs, touching the lives of celebrities and ordinary people alike. So settle in, dear listeners, as we explore the murky territory where truth meets fiction, where desperation meets opportunity, and where the human capacity for both belief and deception reveals itself in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the stories we tell ourselves and each other. In December 2024, McKay Coppins, a staff writer at The Atlantic, received what seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. A filmmaker had approached him with what they called a massive story, one so extraordinary that Hollywood was already circling, eager to transform it into a blockbuster film. The story centered around a man named Mauricio Morales, known simply as Mao to those who knew him. According to the filmmaker's pitch, Mao's tale was one of unimaginable survival against impossible odds, a narrative that seemed torn from the pages of the most extreme thriller novels. Mao claimed that he had been kidnapped by a Mexican cartel while traveling through Mexico. But this wasn't just another tragic story of cartel violence. What Mao alleged happened next defied all conventional understanding of how these criminal organizations operate. According to Mao's account, his captors had discovered something remarkable about their prisoner. During their interrogation, they learned that Mao was not just an ordinary victim, he was a former Olympian, an athlete whose physical capabilities far exceeded those of typical kidnapping victims. This revelation, Mao claimed, changed everything about his captivity. Rather than demanding ransom or executing him as might be expected, the cartel had allegedly made a decision that sounded more like something from a dystopian science fiction film than from the brutal reality of Mexican organized crime. They decided to use him. What Mao described next stretched the boundaries of credibility to their absolute limits. He claimed that he had been forced to participate in what he called an intercartel sporting tournament, a secret competition where representatives from different criminal organizations would compete against each other in various athletic events. But this wasn't merely about pride or bragging rights. According to Mao's extraordinary narrative, these tournaments were matters of life and death. Competitors who failed to perform adequately faced execution, while those who succeeded might earn their freedom, or at least another chance to survive until the next competition. The implications of such a claim were staggering. If true, it would mean that Mexico's notorious cartels, organizations known for their ruthless efficiency and business-focused approach to violence, had developed an elaborate system of competitive entertainment that required significant resources, coordination, and time. More troubling still was the implication that these tournaments represented some form of systematic, organized sadism that went far beyond the strategic violence typically associated with cartel operations. These organizations are known to be brutally pragmatic, violence served specific purposes of intimidation, territorial control, and business protection. The idea that they would invest resources in elaborate sporting competitions seemed to contradict everything criminologists and law enforcement officials understood about their operational methods. Yet Mao's story came with details that seemed to lend it credibility. He spoke with apparent trauma about specific events, described locations with what seemed like intimate knowledge, and presented himself as a man genuinely terrorized by his experiences. He claimed that his Olympic background had made him particularly valuable to his captors, who saw in him an opportunity to demonstrate their power and sophistication to rival organizations. The tournaments, according to his account, were not merely about competition, they were about status, about proving which cartel commanded the most impressive resources and capabilities. For McKay Coppins, the journalist approached with this story, the initial reaction was exactly what any experienced investigator would expect: profound skepticism. The narrative contained too many elements that seemed lifted from popular entertainment, too many coincidences that aligned perfectly with what audiences might find thrilling rather than what criminal organizations might find practical. But Coppins also understood that the most important stories often begin with the most unbelievable claims. His professional experience had taught him that truth can sometimes be stranger than fiction, and that dismissing extraordinary claims without investigation can mean missing crucial stories that deserve to be told. The decision to pursue the investigation was not made lightly. It would require significant time, resources, and potentially dangerous travel to Mexico to verify Mao's claims. It would mean conducting interviews with individuals who might be at risk if their identities were revealed, and navigating the complex world of Mexican organized crime where mistakes could have deadly consequences. Yet the potential importance of the story, if true, made the investigation worthwhile. If Mexican cartels were indeed operating systematic torture tournaments, it would represent a significant escalation in their methods and would require immediate attention from law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Moreover, the story touched on broader themes that resonated far beyond the specifics of Mao's alleged experience. It raised questions about how criminal organizations evolve and adapt, about the intersection of violence and entertainment, and about the ways in which extreme circumstances can create situations that challenge our understanding of human behavior. McKay Coppins understood that agreeing to investigate Mao's story meant entering a world where the usual rules of journalism would be tested to their limits. This wasn't simply a matter of fact-checking documents or interviewing sources who could speak freely about their experiences, it meant trying to verify claims about events that, by their very nature, would leave little concrete evidence. The initial conversations with Mao revealed a man who presented himself as deeply traumatized by his experiences. He spoke haltingly about details of his alleged captivity, displaying what appeared to be genuine psychological distress when discussing particular aspects of his ordeal. During their first extended interview, Mao provided what seemed like a comprehensive timeline of his kidnapping and subsequent forced participation in the cartel tournaments. He described being taken while traveling through a region of Mexico known for cartel activity, though he remained vague about the specific circumstances that had led him to be in that location at that time. According to his account, the initial period of his captivity had followed familiar patterns described in other documented cartel kidnappings. He had been held in basic conditions, interrogated about his background and potential value for ransom purposes, and subjected to psychological intimidation designed to break his resistance. But Mao claimed that everything changed when his captors discovered his Olympic credentials. He described the moment when one of his guards had recognized his name from sports coverage, leading to excited conversations among the cartel members about the potential value of having a former Olympian at their disposal. The tournaments themselves, according to Mao's detailed accounts, took place in various locations throughout central Mexico. He described elaborate facilities that had been constructed specifically for these competitions, gymnasiums with professional-grade equipment, medical facilities staffed by doctors who presumably worked under duress, and spectator areas where cartel leaders and their associates would gather to watch the events unfold. The competitive events, as Mao described them, ranged from straightforward athletic competitions like running and swimming to more complex challenges that combined physical skill with psychological endurance. Some competitions allegedly required participants to perform under deliberately stressful conditions, while others involved direct combat between competitors. What made these accounts particularly disturbing was Mao's description of the stakes involved. He claimed that poor performance in the tournaments could result in immediate execution, while exceptional performance might earn temporary reprieve or, in rare cases, eventual freedom. More troubling still were his descriptions of other participants, men and women from various backgrounds who had been forced into these competitions through different circumstances. Some, he claimed, were athletes like himself who had been specifically targeted for their abilities. Others were ordinary kidnapping victims who had demonstrated unexpected physical capabilities during their captivity. As Coppens listened to these accounts during multiple interviews conducted over several months, he found himself grappling with fundamental questions about the nature of truth and evidence in journalism. Mao's story was consistent in its broad outlines, and his emotional responses seemed genuine, yet the claims themselves stretched credibility in ways that demanded extraordinary verification. The challenge was compounded by the inherently secretive nature of the alleged events. If such tournaments existed, they would operate far from public scrutiny, leaving few witnesses who could safely come forward, and minimal physical evidence that could be independently verified. Coppens recognized that traditional journalistic methods, document review, multiple source verification, official confirmation, would be insufficient for this investigation. The story would require him to enter Mexico and attempt to verify details through direct observation and interviews with individuals who might themselves be at risk. The decision to travel to Mexico was not made lightly. Coppens understood that investigating cartel activities, even as a journalist, carried inherent dangers. The organizations involved in such activities do not typically welcome scrutiny, and the wrong questions asked in the wrong places could have serious consequences. To mitigate these risks, Coppens arranged to work with a local fixer, a journalist or consultant familiar with the region who could provide guidance on safe approaches to sensitive investigations. He also made arrangements for security support during visits to areas known to be under cartel control. But even with these precautions, the investigation would require Coppens to make judgment calls about which leads to pursue and which risks were acceptable in service of the story. Each interview, each location visit, each attempt to verify details of Mao's account would require careful consideration of both journalistic value and personal safety. As the investigation planning progressed, Coppens found himself returning repeatedly to fundamental questions about the story's plausibility. While he maintained professional skepticism about Mao's specific claims, he also recognized that Mexican cartels had demonstrated remarkable creativity and ruthlessness in their operations over the years. These organizations had shown themselves capable of extraordinary violence, sophisticated corruption schemes, and complex logistical operations. They had proven adept at adapting to law enforcement pressure and finding new ways to demonstrate power and control territory. Yet the specific claims Mao was making seemed to serve no clear strategic purpose for criminal organizations that typically focused on profit maximization and territorial control. The resources required to maintain such tournaments, facilities, personnel, medical support, security, would represent significant ongoing expenses with unclear returns on investment. Moreover, the operational security risks of such activities would be enormous. Large-scale competitions involving multiple participants would create numerous opportunities for information leaks, law enforcement infiltration, or rivals to gain intelligence about organizational capabilities and locations. These practical considerations weighed heavily on Coppens' mind as he prepared for the investigation trip to Mexico. He understood that he would need to approach the story with an open mind while maintaining healthy skepticism about claims that defied conventional understanding of criminal organization behavior. The flight to Mexico City carried with it the weight of months of preparation and the uncertainty of what McKay Coppens might discover once he began investigating Mao's claims on the ground. The journalist had arranged his itinerary carefully, planning to meet not only with Mao himself but also with his associates, family members, and anyone else who might be able to shed light on the extraordinary story he had been told. Upon arriving in Mexico City, Coppens was struck by the normalcy of the bustling metropolis. The city's millions of residents went about their daily lives with little apparent concern for the dramatic narratives of cartel violence that dominated international media coverage of Mexico. Yet he understood that beneath this surface normalcy lay complex realities of organized crime influence that could make his investigation both crucial and dangerous. His first meeting with Mao in person was arranged at a location Mao claimed would be safe from potential cartel surveillance. The man who greeted Coppens appeared genuinely nervous, frequently scanning their surroundings and speaking in hushed tones about the risks he believed they both faced simply by discussing his alleged experiences. In person, Mao's account gained new dimensions that hadn't been apparent during their phone interviews. He showed Coppens what he claimed were scars from injuries sustained during the tournaments, pointing to marks on his arms and torso that he said resulted from various competitions and punishments. The physical evidence was compelling but not conclusive. The scars could have resulted from any number of experiences, and without medical documentation of when and how they had been sustained, they couldn't definitively support his specific claims about cartel tournaments. More significant was Mao's detailed knowledge of locations throughout Mexico City and surrounding areas. He was able to provide specific directions to places where he claimed various aspects of his ordeal had taken place, describing buildings, neighborhoods, and geographic features with the precision of someone who had spent significant time in these locations. Yet as Coppens accompanied Mao to some of these locations, the first cracks in the narrative began to emerge. While Mao could indeed navigate confidently through areas he claimed to have been held, the specific details of his descriptions didn't always match the physical realities they encountered. At one location where Mao claimed a major tournament had taken place, they found a building that showed no signs of the extensive modifications he had described. The facility was clearly too small to accommodate the large-scale competitions Mao had detailed, and local residents indicated that it had been used for entirely different purposes during the time period in question. When Coppens pointed out these discrepancies, Mao became visibly agitated. He insisted that his memories of the traumatic events might be somewhat confused, and that the specific locations might have been altered or demolished since his captivity. While these explanations weren't impossible, they represented the first significant challenges to the narrative's consistency. The investigation took on additional complexity when Coppens began interviewing members of Mao's family and social circle. These conversations were conducted with extreme care, as Coppens understood that if Mao's story were true, these individuals might themselves be at risk from cartel retaliation. Mao's family members presented a portrait of a man who had indeed disappeared for an extended period, supporting at least the basic framework of his claims about being held against his will. They described their fear and confusion during the months when they had no contact with him, and their relief when he eventually re-established communication. However, their accounts of Mao's behavior both before and after his alleged captivity raised new questions about his story. Several family members described him as someone who had always been drawn to dramatic narratives and had occasionally exaggerated experiences for effect, though they emphasized that they had never known him to fabricate stories entirely. More troubling were discrepancies in the timeline of events. While Mao claimed to have been held for specific periods corresponding to multiple tournament cycles, family members recalled different patterns of communication and absence that didn't align perfectly with his account. The investigation became more complex still when Coppens attempted to verify Mao's Olympic credentials. While Mao had indeed participated in Olympic competition, his actual performance and prominence in the athletic world were significantly less impressive than his story suggested. This revelation was particularly significant because Mao's alleged value to the cartels was supposedly based on his exceptional athletic abilities and international recognition. If his actual Olympic experience was more modest than claimed, it would undermine the central premise of why cartels would have found him particularly useful for their alleged tournaments. As these discrepancies accumulated, Coppens found himself facing a difficult decision about how to proceed with the investigation. While the mounting evidence suggested significant problems with Mao's account, completely dismissing the story without exhaustive investigation would be premature. The journalist decided to expand his investigation beyond Mao's specific claims to examine whether there was any broader evidence of cartel tournament activities in Mexico. This research involved consulting with law enforcement officials, cartel experts, and other journalists who had extensively covered organized crime in the region. These consultations proved revealing in ways Coppens hadn't anticipated. While experts confirmed that Mexican cartels had engaged in increasingly sophisticated and sometimes seemingly irrational acts of violence, none had encountered any credible reports of systematic sporting tournaments involving kidnapped participants. More significantly, several experts pointed out that such activities would be fundamentally inconsistent with how modern cartels operate. These organizations function as businesses, with violence serving strategic purposes related to territorial control, intimidation, and profit protection. The resources and risks required for elaborate tournament systems would represent an inefficient allocation of assets that sophisticated criminal organizations would be unlikely to pursue. As this expert consultation process continued, Coppens realized that his investigation was taking an unexpected turn. Rather than finding evidence to support or definitively debunk Mao's extraordinary claims, he was uncovering a more complex story about the nature of truth, deception, and the human tendency to believe extraordinary narratives. The deeper McKay Coppens delved into his investigation, the more apparent it became that Mao's story was not simply a case of traumatic memory confusion or exaggerated recollections. The inconsistencies and contradictions that emerged suggested something far more deliberate and systematic than misremembered details. A crucial breakthrough came when Coppens began investigating Mao's financial situation and activities during the period when he claimed to have been held captive by cartels. Banking records and other financial documentation revealed patterns of activity that were entirely inconsistent with someone who had been kidnapped and held against their will for months. During the very time periods when Mao claimed to have been competing for his life in cartel tournaments, financial records showed him making regular transactions, paying bills, and engaging in normal economic activity. More significantly, some of these transactions occurred in locations far from where he claimed to have been held, and at times when he supposedly would have been under complete cartel control. When confronted with this evidence, Mao's responses became increasingly evasive and contradictory. He claimed that cartel members had somehow gained access to his financial accounts and were conducting transactions to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but this explanation couldn't account for the specific timing and nature of many of the documented activities. The investigation took another significant turn when Coppens began exploring Mao's connections to various organizations and individuals who had become involved with his story. What emerged was a complex network of relationships that suggested Mao's narrative served purposes far beyond simply sharing his alleged traumatic experience. One of the most significant discoveries involved Mao's relationship with an international non-governmental organization that had become interested in his story. This NGO, which focused on human rights issues related to cartel violence, had apparently been considering featuring Mao's experience as part of a broader campaign to raise awareness about the evolving nature of organized crime in Mexico. The organization had already begun preliminary work on materials that would highlight Mao's story as an example of how cartel violence was becoming more sophisticated and systematically cruel. They had invested time and resources in initial verification efforts, though these had apparently been less thorough than the investigation Coppens was now conducting. More troubling was the discovery that Mao had been providing inconsistent versions of his story to different organizations and individuals. While the core elements remained constant, significant details varied depending on his audience and the specific purposes for which the story was being considered. To the filmmaker who had initially approached Coppens, Mao had emphasized the most cinematically compelling aspects of his alleged experience: the life-or-death competitions, the elaborate tournament structures, and the dramatic moments of survival against impossible odds. To the human rights organization, he had focused more heavily on the systematic nature of the violence and its implications for understanding cartel evolution. To potential media outlets, Mao had presented versions of the story that emphasized different aspects depending on each organization's typical coverage areas and audience interests. These variations weren't necessarily contradictory, but they suggested a level of strategic narrative adaptation that seemed inconsistent with someone simply trying to share a traumatic experience. The investigation became more complex when Coppens discovered that Mao had been using multiple identities and false credentials in various contexts. While his basic biographical information appeared to be accurate, he had embellished or entirely fabricated significant aspects of his background and qualifications. Most significantly, his Olympic credentials, while technically accurate, had been dramatically overstated. While Mao had indeed participated in Olympic competition, his actual role had been far more modest than his story suggested. He had not been a prominent athlete whose disappearance would have attracted international attention, nor had he achieved the level of performance that would make him particularly valuable to organizations seeking athletic excellence. These discoveries led Coppens to investigate whether Mao might have been involved in other fraudulent activities or deceptive schemes. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that suggested someone who had developed considerable skill at crafting compelling narratives for various purposes over an extended period. Public records revealed that Mao had been involved in several business ventures that had failed under suspicious circumstances, leaving investors and partners with significant losses. In several of these cases, Mao had presented himself with credentials and experience that appeared to have been exaggerated or falsified. Moreover, there were indications that he had previously attempted to sell dramatic personal narratives to media organizations and entertainment companies. While none of these earlier efforts had succeeded to the extent that his cartel tournament story had, they suggested a pattern of behavior focused on monetizing extraordinary claims about personal experiences. More concerning was the discovery that some of these interested parties had already begun making financial commitments based on Mao's story. Option payments had been made for film rights, and at least one organization had provided financial support for what they believed were legitimate security and medical needs related to his ongoing trauma. The scope of the potential fraud became clearer as Coppens traced the various ways in which Mao's story had been leveraged for financial and professional benefit. The narrative had opened doors and created opportunities that would have been entirely unavailable based on Mao's actual background and experiences. Yet perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Mao's deception extended beyond simple financial fraud. His false narrative about cartel activities had the potential to influence public policy discussions, law enforcement priorities, and international perceptions of organized crime in Mexico. If accepted as credible, Mao's claims could have led to misallocation of resources by law enforcement agencies, inappropriate policy responses by government officials, and distorted public understanding of how cartels actually operate. The story had the potential to cause real harm through the spread of misinformation about serious security issues. As McKay Coppens continued to unravel the threads of Mao's elaborate deception, he discovered that the web of lies extended far beyond simple financial fraud or media manipulation. The investigation revealed connections that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, linkages to Mexican celebrities, international figures, and even legendary artists that suggested the scope of Mao's fabrications was far more ambitious than initially apparent. One of the most startling discoveries involved Mao's alleged connections to prominent figures in Mexican entertainment and sports. According to documentation Coppens uncovered, Mao had claimed to several potential business partners that his cartel ordeal had brought him to the attention of high-profile Mexican celebrities who were interested in supporting his recovery and helping to tell his story. These claims had apparently been supported by what appeared to be communications from representatives of these celebrities, expressing interest in Mao's story and offering various forms of support. However, when Coppens attempted to verify these communications through official channels, he discovered that they were entirely fabricated. The celebrities in question had never heard of Mao, had no knowledge of his story, and had certainly never authorized any representatives to make contact on their behalf. The communications that had impressed potential investors and collaborators were sophisticated forgeries that demonstrated considerable skill in document fabrication and identity manipulation. More remarkable still was the discovery that Mao had somehow managed to create apparent connections to international figures, including claims about interest from Yoko Ono herself. According to materials Mao had shared with various parties, the legendary artist and activist had supposedly become aware of his story through her network of contacts focused on peace and human rights issues. The alleged connection to Yoko Ono was presented as validation of the international significance of Mao's experience and the broader implications of his story for understanding modern organized crime. Documents suggested that she was considering lending her support to efforts to bring greater attention to the systematic nature of cartel violence as exemplified by Mao's experience. When Coppens investigated these claims, he found no evidence whatsoever that Yoko Ono had any awareness of Mao or his story. Representatives for the artist confirmed that she had received no communications about the case and had never expressed any interest in the narrative Mao was promoting. The sophistication of these fabricated celebrity connections was remarkable for several reasons. First, they demonstrated that Mao had developed considerable skill not just in creating compelling narratives, but in producing supporting documentation that could convince sophisticated audiences of their authenticity. Second, the specific celebrities and figures chosen for these fabricated connections showed strategic thinking about which names would be most likely to impress different audiences. Mexican celebrities would appeal to domestic media and business interests, while international figures like Yoko Ono would suggest broader significance and credibility. Most concerning, however, was what these discoveries suggested about the potential scope of Mao's deceptive activities. Creating convincing forgeries of communications from celebrity representatives required access to professional letterhead, knowledge of appropriate communication styles, and understanding of how such relationships typically function. This level of sophistication suggested that Mao was not simply an opportunistic individual who had stumbled into a successful deception, but rather someone who had developed systematic approaches to creating and maintaining false narratives. The celebrity connections were just one element of what appeared to be a comprehensive program of identity manipulation and credential fabrication. The investigation revealed that Mao had been cultivating these false celebrity connections for months, carefully building a network of apparent endorsements and interests that could be leveraged for various purposes. He had used these alleged connections to gain credibility with potential business partners, media organizations, and even the human rights NGO that had become interested in his story. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some legitimate organizations had modified their own activities based on what they believed were credible celebrity endorsements of Mao's story. The Human Rights NGO, for example, had redirected resources toward investigating cartel tournament activities partly because they believed that prominent figures were taking the claim seriously. Media organizations had elevated the priority they placed on Mao's story partly because the apparent celebrity interest suggested broader cultural significance that would resonate with their audiences. The fabricated endorsements had served as a form of social proof that amplified the impact of Mao's core deception. As Coppens traced the timeline of how these celebrity connections had developed, he discovered that they had been introduced strategically at moments when Mao's story was facing increased scrutiny or skepticism. When potential partners raised questions about specific details of his cartel experience, the celebrity endorsements provided alternative forms of validation that could redirect attention away from problematic aspects of his narrative. The psychological impact of these false celebrity connections was particularly significant because they exploited natural human tendencies to defer to perceived authority and social status. Most people are more inclined to believe extraordinary claims when they appear to be endorsed by individuals they respect or admire. Moreover, the specific figures chosen for these fabricated connections were individuals known for their involvement in social justice and human rights causes. This created an implicit suggestion that skepticism about Mao's story might be inappropriate or insensitive to genuine victims of violence. The discovery of these fabricated celebrity connections marked a turning point in Coppens' investigation. What had begun as an attempt to verify extraordinary claims about cartel activities had evolved into an exploration of sophisticated fraud that had implications far beyond Mao's individual case. The level of planning, resource allocation, and strategic thinking required to create and maintain such an elaborate deception suggested professional-level expertise in manipulation and fraud. It raised questions about whether Mao might be part of a larger network of individuals involved in similar activities, or whether his case represented an isolated example of exceptional individual deception. The revelation that Mao had successfully deceived not only individual investors and media companies but also an established international NGO represented perhaps the most troubling aspect of his elaborate fraud. The organization in question was not a small, inexperienced group, but rather a well-respected institution with years of experience investigating and documenting human rights abuses in Mexico and other regions affected by organized crime. McKay Coppens' investigation into this aspect of the case revealed how sophisticated Mao's approach had become, and how effectively he had learned to exploit the legitimate concerns and institutional priorities of organizations genuinely committed to addressing cartel violence. The NGO's involvement demonstrated that even experienced professionals with extensive knowledge of the subject matter could be deceived by sufficiently elaborate and strategically crafted false narratives. The International Human Rights Organization had first encountered Mao's story through their network of contacts focused on documenting evolving patterns of cartel violence in Mexico. His claims about systematic tournament-style torture aligned with their ongoing concerns about the increasing sophistication and cruelty of organized crime activities in the region. For an organization whose mission centered on exposing and preventing exactly the kinds of systematic human rights abuses Mao was describing, his story represented both a horrifying example of cartel evolution and an opportunity to demonstrate the need for increased international attention to these issues. The apparent documentation of organized, competitive torture represented a new level of systematic cruelty that warranted immediate investigation and public exposure. Mao had approached the organization with what appeared to be comprehensive documentation of his experience, including detailed accounts of the tournament structures, descriptions of facilities where the competitions took place, and even names of other alleged victims who had participated in similar events. The level of detail and internal consistency of his account impressed experienced investigators who had evaluated numerous claims about cartel activities over the years. Moreover, Mao presented himself as someone who was willing to cooperate fully with their investigation efforts, despite the obvious personal risks such cooperation would entail. He claimed to be motivated not by personal gain but by a desire to ensure that the systematic nature of cartel torture activities was properly documented and exposed to prevent other victims from experiencing similar ordeals. The organization's initial verification efforts had focused on elements of Mao's story that could be independently confirmed through conventional investigative methods. They had verified his basic biographical information, confirmed his presence in Mexico during the relevant time periods, and consulted with their network of contacts in Mexican law enforcement and civil society organizations. These preliminary investigations had found no direct contradictions to Mao's account, and several aspects of his story aligned with patterns of cartel behavior that the organization had documented in other contexts. While they hadn't found independent confirmation of the specific tournament activities, the absence of such confirmation was not surprising given the inherently secretive nature of cartel operations. Based on these initial findings, the organization had begun developing plans to feature Mao's case as a central element of a broader campaign focused on what they believed was a dangerous evolution in cartel violence. They had allocated significant resources toward additional investigation, begun developing educational materials that highlighted the systematic nature of the torture he described, and started reaching out to other international human rights organizations to coordinate response efforts. The NGO had also begun providing direct support to Mao, recognizing that someone who had survived such experiences and was willing to speak publicly about them would face ongoing security risks. This support included financial assistance for security measures, medical care for trauma-related health issues, and legal consultation regarding his safety options. Perhaps most significantly, the organization had begun modifying its own research priorities and resource allocation based on what they believed was credible evidence of organized tournament torture. They had redirected investigators toward trying to identify other victims of similar activities, started developing new methodologies for documenting this form of systematic abuse, and began engaging with policymakers about appropriate responses to these evolving threats. When Koppin's investigation began revealing the extent of Mao's deception, the implications for the NGO were profound and troubling. The organization had not simply been deceived about one individual's experience, they had been manipulated into fundamentally altering their approach to understanding and combating cartel violence based on entirely fabricated information. The resources they had allocated toward investigating tournament torture could have been directed toward addressing real and documented forms of cartel abuse. The policy recommendations they had begun developing were based on non-existent threats, potentially leading government agencies and international partners toward inappropriate responses to actual security challenges. More troubling still was the potential impact on the organization's credibility and effectiveness. When the truth about Mao's deception eventually became public, it would inevitably raise questions about the NGO's verification procedures and judgment that could undermine their ability to advocate effectively for genuine victims of cartel violence. The case also revealed vulnerabilities in how human rights organizations approach extraordinary claims about evolving forms of abuse. The NGO's commitment to believing and supporting victims of violence, while essential to their mission, had been exploited by someone who understood exactly how to present false information in ways that would resonate with their institutional priorities and values. Koppins discovered that Mao had demonstrated remarkable sophistication in understanding how international human rights organizations operate, what kinds of evidence they find compelling, and what procedural and ethical constraints limit their ability to conduct certain types of verification activities. He had crafted his deception specifically to exploit these organizational characteristics and limitations. The psychological manipulation involved was particularly sophisticated because it exploited the organization's genuine commitment to addressing cartel violence. By presenting claims that aligned perfectly with their existing concerns and priorities, Mao had made skepticism about his story appear potentially inconsistent with the organization's mission and values. Moreover, the international profile and reputation of the NGO had served Mao's broader deceptive purposes by providing credibility and validation for his claims in other contexts. His ability to claim that a respected international organization was taking his story seriously enhanced his credibility with media companies, potential business partners, and other audiences he was attempting to deceive. As McKay Coppins continued to piece together the full scope of Mao's extraordinary deception, he found himself confronting questions that extended far beyond the immediate case. What kind of individual develops the capability to construct and maintain such an elaborate web of lies? What psychological factors drive someone to create narratives of such complexity and ambition? And perhaps most importantly, what does this case reveal about our collective vulnerability to sophisticated deception in the modern information environment? The investigation into Mao's background revealed patterns of behavior that suggested his cartel tournament story was not an isolated incident but rather the culmination of a lengthy development process in which he had gradually refined his skills at creating and monetizing false narratives. Public records and interviews with individuals who had known him over the years painted a picture of someone who had consistently presented himself differently to different audiences, adapting his persona and credentials to match the expectations and interests of whoever he was trying to influence. Former business associates described Mao as someone who possessed remarkable intuitive understanding of what people wanted to hear and how to present information in ways that would resonate with their particular concerns or interests. He had demonstrated exceptional ability to research potential targets, understand their professional or personal priorities, and craft approaches that would appeal specifically to those priorities. More troubling was evidence that Mao had systematically studied successful examples of media manipulation and fraud, apparently learning from both criminal cases and legitimate marketing and public relations strategies. His approach to creating false celebrity endorsements, for example, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how social proof and perceived authority influence decision-making processes. The psychological profile that emerged was of someone who had developed what might be characterized as professional-level expertise in manipulation and deception. Unlike opportunistic fraud that exploits immediate circumstances, Mao's activities required long-term planning, resource allocation, and strategic thinking that suggested a systematic approach to developing and deploying deceptive capabilities. Yet perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Mao appeared to have convinced himself, at least partially, of the truth of his own fabrications. Interviews with individuals who had interacted with him extensively suggested that his emotional responses to discussions of his alleged trauma were genuinely felt, even though the events themselves were entirely fictional. This psychological phenomenon, sometimes referred to as confabulation or false memory syndrome in therapeutic contexts, represents one of the most challenging aspects of investigating sophisticated deception. When perpetrators genuinely believe their own lies, they can present with the emotional authenticity and conviction that typically distinguish truthful accounts from deliberate fabrication. The implications of this psychological dimension extended to everyone who had been deceived by Mao's narrative. Experienced journalists, seasoned investigators, and professional human rights advocates had all found his presentations compelling partly because his emotional responses appeared entirely genuine. Coppins' investigation revealed that Mao had developed remarkable skill at triggering psychological responses in his audiences that would make them more receptive to his narratives. He consistently presented his story in contexts that would evoke empathy, moral outrage, and desire to help, creating emotional states that could override critical analytical thinking. The timing and setting of his presentations were carefully orchestrated to maximize their psychological impact. He would often begin with relatively modest claims that established his credibility, then gradually introduce more extraordinary elements after his audience had already made initial commitments to believing and supporting him. This technique, known in psychology as the foot-in-the-door method, exploits the human tendency toward consistency. Once individuals have made initial commitments to believing someone and providing support, they become psychologically invested in maintaining that belief even when presented with contradictory evidence. The case also demonstrated how modern information environments can amplify the impact of sophisticated deception. Mao's story had spread across multiple platforms and contexts, with each new audience providing additional validation that could be leveraged to convince subsequent targets. Social media and digital communication technologies had enabled him to create and maintain false identities with unprecedented ease. The fabricated celebrity endorsements, false credentials, and manufactured supporting documentation could be created and distributed with minimal resources but maximum impact. The psychological impact on Mao's victims was profound and varied depending on their individual roles in the deception. The human rights organization experienced not only financial losses but also profound questions about their institutional judgment and procedures. Individual investors faced both monetary damages and the psychological impact of having been manipulated by someone they had trusted and supported. Perhaps most troubling was the potential impact on public understanding of genuine cartel violence and human rights abuses. When sophisticated deceptions are eventually exposed, they can create cynicism and skepticism that makes it more difficult for real victims to be believed and supported. The case raised fundamental questions about how individuals and institutions should balance appropriate skepticism with necessary openness to extraordinary claims. While maintaining healthy skepticism is essential for preventing deception, excessive suspicion can prevent the recognition and documentation of genuine abuses that genuinely are extraordinary in their scope and cruelty. For journalists, the case highlighted the challenges of investigating claims that, by their nature, cannot be easily verified through conventional methods. When stories involve inherently secretive activities, limited evidence, and traumatized sources, the normal procedures for fact-checking and verification may be insufficient. The investigation suggested that modern deception has evolved to exploit not just individual psychological vulnerabilities, but also the structural characteristics of contemporary institutions and information systems. Mao's success required understanding how NGOs, media companies, and business organizations make decisions, allocate resources, and verify information. The filmmaker who had originally approached Coppens with Mao's story had, upon closer examination, conducted minimal verification before becoming enthusiastic about the project's potential. The dramatic elements of the narrative, the life-or-death competitions, the exotic locations, the ultimate triumph over impossible odds, had precisely the cinematic appeal that would attract both audiences and investors in Hollywood's competitive environment. Yet even basic research into comparable cases would have revealed that Mao's claims were inconsistent with documented patterns of cartel behavior. The filmmaker had been so focused on the story's entertainment value that fundamental questions about its plausibility had been set aside in favor of securing rights and developing the project as quickly as possible. This pattern of prioritizing narrative appeal over verification had been repeated across multiple contexts as Mao's story gained momentum. Media organizations that had expressed interest in various aspects of the story had focused primarily on its dramatic potential rather than conducting thorough investigation into its factual basis. The timeline inconsistencies that Coppens eventually uncovered had been apparent to several individuals who had interacted with Mao, but these concerns had been dismissed or rationalized rather than pursued systematically. When presented with contradictory information, Mao had consistently provided explanations that, while not impossible, required accepting increasingly elaborate additional assumptions. The psychological sophistication of Mao's approach became clearer as Coppens reviewed recordings and transcripts of various interviews and presentations. Mao had demonstrated remarkable skill at reading his audiences and adapting his narrative emphasis to match their particular interests and concerns. To entertainment industry professionals, he had emphasized the cinematic elements of his story and its potential for dramatic adaptation. To human rights advocates, he had focused on the systematic nature of the abuse and its implications for understanding cartel evolution. To potential business partners, he had highlighted the opportunities for leveraging his unique experience across multiple platforms and contexts. This adaptive storytelling ability had served a dual purpose. It made each audience feel that they were receiving information specifically relevant to their interests, while also making it difficult for any single group to develop a comprehensive understanding of the inconsistencies across different versions of his account. By compartmentalizing different aspects of his story for different audiences, Mao had effectively prevented systematic cross-checking that might have revealed contradictions. The investigation also revealed that several individuals who had interacted with Mao had privately expressed skepticism about aspects of his story, but had not shared these concerns with others who were also evaluating his claims. Professional courtesy, competitive considerations, and social pressure had all contributed to an environment where doubts were kept private rather than being systematically explored. This phenomenon highlighted a broader problem in how modern professional networks handle information sharing about potentially fraudulent individuals. While legal and ethical constraints appropriately limit the sharing of unsubstantiated suspicions, these same protections can enable sophisticated fraudsters to move between contexts without accumulating the pattern recognition that would expose their activities. The role of confirmation bias in enabling Mao's deception was particularly significant. His story aligned perfectly with existing concerns about cartel evolution, media narratives about Mexican violence, and cultural expectations about survival stories. These alignments made audiences more likely to accept his claims and less likely to scrutinize them critically. For the human rights organization, Mao's narrative confirmed their worst fears about how organized crime was becoming more systematic and cruel. For entertainment industry professionals, it provided exactly the kind of exotic, high-stakes narrative that audiences found compelling. For media organizations, it offered a dramatic story that would attract attention and engagement. The investigation revealed that this confirmation bias had been deliberately exploited by Mao, who had clearly researched his target audiences extensively before approaching them. His presentations were carefully crafted to tell each audience exactly what they were predisposed to want to hear, making critical evaluation less likely and acceptance more probable. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some individuals and organizations had continued to promote or support Mao's story even after encountering evidence that raised serious questions about its validity. The investments of time, resources, and reputation that had been made based on his claims created powerful incentives to rationalize contradictory evidence rather than acknowledging the possibility of systematic deception. This dynamic illustrated how sophisticated fraud can become self-perpetuating once it reaches sufficient scale and complexity. The more individuals and organizations that become invested in a false narrative, the more pressure exists to maintain belief in that narrative despite mounting contradictory evidence. The media attention that Mao's story had begun to attract before Coppen's investigation exposed its fraudulent nature demonstrated the potential for false narratives to reach massive audiences before proper verification occurs. In the modern information environment, dramatic stories can achieve global reach within hours or days, creating facts on the ground that become difficult to correct even when comprehensive debunking eventually occurs. The case underscored fundamental challenges facing journalism and other information-dependent institutions in an era of sophisticated deception and rapid information distribution. Traditional verification methods, while still essential, may be insufficient for detecting and preventing the most sophisticated forms of modern fraud. As Coppens prepared to publish his investigation, he recognized that the story he would tell would be far different from the one he had originally set out to verify. Rather than documenting extraordinary cartel activities, he would be exposing extraordinary human capacity for deception and the institutional vulnerabilities that enable such deception to succeed. The investigation into Mao's financial activities required Coppens to work with forensic accounting specialists and legal experts familiar with international fraud cases. The complexity of the financial structures Mao had created to support his deception was remarkable for its sophistication in strategic planning. Banking records revealed that Mao had established multiple accounts under slightly different variations of his name and credentials, allowing him to compartmentalize different aspects of his fraudulent activities while maintaining plausible explanations for the various income streams he was generating. These accounts had been opened in different jurisdictions, creating additional complexity for anyone attempting to trace the full scope of his financial activities. The filmmaker who had originally expressed interest in Mao's story had provided substantial option payments for the rights to develop his narrative into a motion picture. These payments, which totaled tens of thousands of dollars, had been justified as necessary to secure exclusive access to what was presented as an extraordinary and potentially valuable intellectual property. But the option payments were just the beginning of Mao's financial extraction from the entertainment industry's interest in his story. He had also negotiated consultant fees for his participation in script development, secured advances for his cooperation with research activities, and arranged ongoing payments for what were described as security and medical expenses related to his ongoing recovery from trauma. The human rights organization had proven to be an even more significant source of financial support. Beyond the direct assistance they had provided for security and medical expenses, they had also funded travel costs for Mao to attend conferences and meetings, paid for legal consultation regarding his safety options, and provided living expenses during periods when he claimed to be unable to work due to ongoing psychological effects of his alleged ordeal. More significantly, the organization had redirected substantial resources toward investigating the systematic tournament torture that Mao had described. These investigative efforts, which involved deploying experienced researchers to Mexico and other locations, had cost the organization hundreds of thousands of dollars in personnel time, travel expenses, and operational costs. The financial impact on individual victims was equally significant. Several private investors had provided funding for various aspects of Mao's story development and promotion, convinced that his narrative represented valuable intellectual property with substantial commercial potential. One investor had provided seed funding for what Mao had described as a comprehensive documentation project that would include book publication, documentary production, and educational material development. Another had funded the development of security protocols and infrastructure that Mao claimed were necessary to protect him from ongoing cartel retaliation. The investigation revealed that Mao had become remarkably sophisticated at identifying and exploiting different types of funding sources for different aspects of his fabricated narrative. Entertainment industry professionals were approached with commercial opportunities, human rights organizations were presented with mission-aligned projects, and individual investors were offered various forms of profit-sharing arrangements. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that some of the financial arrangements Mao had established were structured to continue generating income even if questions arose about his story's validity. Contract terms had been negotiated that would make it difficult for victims to recover their investments even if fraud were eventually proven. The forensic accounting investigation also revealed evidence of money laundering activities that suggested Mao's deception extended beyond simple fraud into more serious criminal territory. Funds received from various sources had been moved through multiple accounts and jurisdictions in ways that appeared designed to obscure their origins and destinations. Some of these financial movements had no apparent legitimate purpose other than creating complexity that would make investigation and recovery more difficult. The sophistication of these arrangements suggested that Mao had received professional advice about structuring financial activities to minimize legal exposure and maximize extraction potential. The investigation uncovered evidence that Mao had been using his fraudulent income to fund an increasingly elaborate lifestyle that included expensive travel, luxury accommodations, and high-end consumer purchases. Credit card records and other financial documentation showed spending patterns entirely inconsistent with someone genuinely traumatized and fearful of ongoing cartel retaliation. More concerning were indications that Mao had been using some of the fraudulent proceeds to fund additional deceptive activities. Expenses for document fabrication, identity creation, and other activities supporting his elaborate deception had been paid for using money obtained from victims who believed they were supporting his recovery and story documentation. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Mao had been systematically targeting individuals and organizations that he had identified as particularly vulnerable to his specific form of deception. His research into potential victims had been extensive and strategic, focusing on entities that had both the resources to provide substantial support and the institutional characteristics that would make them susceptible to his narrative. The financial investigation revealed that the total amount extracted through Mao's deception exceeded what any of the individual victims had realized. While each organization or individual had been aware of their own financial commitments, none had understood the full scope of the parallel commitments being made by others based on the same false narrative. This compartmentalization had served multiple purposes. It had prevented victims from comparing notes and potentially identifying inconsistencies, it had maximized the total amount that could be extracted across all sources, and it had created legal and practical complications for recovery efforts once the fraud was exposed. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Mao had been developing additional fraudulent schemes based on the success of his cartel tournament narrative. Financial records and communication fragments suggested that he had been planning to expand his operations to include additional false identities and fabricated experiences that could be monetized through similar approaches. As McKay Coppin's investigation expanded beyond the immediate financial and personal impacts of Mao's deception, the broader international implications of the case began to emerge with troubling clarity. What had initially appeared to be an isolated incident of sophisticated fraud was revealed to have potential consequences that extended across national boundaries and could influence policy decisions, law enforcement priorities, and international cooperation efforts related to organized crime. The most immediate international concern involved the potential impact of Mao's false narrative on legitimate efforts to understand and combat cartel violence in Mexico. His fabricated claims about systematic tournament torture had already begun to influence how some international organizations and government agencies conceptualized the evolution of cartel activities. Intelligence analysts and law enforcement officials in multiple countries had begun allocating resources toward investigating the possibility of organized cartel tournaments based on the apparent credibility of Mao's account. These efforts, while conducted with appropriate professional skepticism, still represented misallocation of limited investigative resources that could have been directed toward addressing documented forms of cartel violence. More troubling was the potential for Mao's false narrative to influence policy discussions at international levels. Government officials responsible for developing strategies to combat transnational organized crime had begun incorporating assumptions about tournament-style torture into their threat assessments and response planning. The human rights organization that had been deceived by Mao had already begun sharing information about systematic tournament torture with partner organizations in other countries. This information sharing, conducted through established networks of legitimate human rights advocacy groups, had the potential to spread false assumptions about cartel evolution across multiple jurisdictions and organizations. International media coverage of Mao's story had already begun appearing in publications across North America and Europe before Coppin's investigation exposed its fraudulent nature. These articles, written by experienced journalists who had relied on the apparent credibility of established sources, had contributed to spreading false information about cartel activities to global audiences. The potential for such false narratives to influence public opinion and political pressure for specific policy responses was particularly concerning. Democratic governments must often respond to public concerns about international security threats, even when those concerns are based on incomplete or inaccurate information. If Mao's fabricated story had continued to gain credibility and media attention, it might have influenced electoral politics in countries where cartel violence and border security are significant political issues. Politicians and advocacy groups might have used his narrative to support particular policy positions without understanding that their arguments were based on entirely false premises. The case also raised troubling questions about the vulnerability of international institutions to sophisticated deception. The human rights organization that had been deceived by Mao was part of a global network of similar institutions that coordinate their activities and share information across national boundaries. The procedures and professional standards that these organizations use to verify extraordinary claims had proven insufficient to detect Mao's sophisticated deception. This suggested that similar organizations worldwide might be vulnerable to comparable manipulation by individuals with sufficient skill and resources to craft compelling false narratives. More concerning was the potential for such deceptions to be weaponized by hostile actors seeking to manipulate international perceptions and policy responses. If a single individual acting primarily for personal financial gain could successfully deceive multiple international organizations and media outlets, more sophisticated actors with greater resources and strategic objectives might achieve even more significant manipulation. The investigation revealed that Mao's deception had exploited specific characteristics of how international organizations and global media networks operate in the contemporary information environment. The speed at which information can spread across borders, combined with the practical limitations on verification that most organizations face, creates opportunities for false narratives to achieve global reach before adequate fact-checking can occur. The case highlighted particular vulnerabilities in how international institutions handle extraordinary claims about evolving security threats. The combination of professional obligation to investigate serious allegations, institutional pressure to respond quickly to emerging threats, and competitive dynamics between organizations can create environments where verification standards may be unconsciously compromised. For diplomatic relationships between countries affected by organized crime, false narratives like Mao's could have serious consequences. If government officials in one country base policy decisions on false information about criminal activities in another country, it could create tensions or misunderstandings that complicate legitimate cooperation efforts. The Mexico-United States relationship, already complex due to legitimate concerns about cartel violence and border security, could be further complicated if false narratives about cartel evolution influence political discourse or policy development in either country. Effective bilateral cooperation requires accurate understanding of actual threats and challenges, not dramatic fiction masquerading as factual reporting. The investigation also revealed potential implications for how international law enforcement agencies share intelligence and coordinate investigations. If false information about cartel activities enters official channels and becomes incorporated into threat assessments or strategic planning documents, it could influence operational decisions with real-world consequences. Intelligence agencies must often make decisions based on incomplete information, but the deliberate introduction of false information into these decision-making processes represents a form of sabotage that could compromise public safety and security. The sophistication of Mao's deception suggested that similar false information could potentially infiltrate official channels if perpetrators understood how to target the right institutions and individuals. The case underscored the need for enhanced verification procedures and information sharing protocols among international institutions dealing with organized crime and human rights issues. While maintaining appropriate sensitivity to genuine victims and legitimate security concerns, these organizations must develop more robust methods for detecting and preventing sophisticated deception. The global nature of modern media and communications meant that correcting false narratives like Mao's required coordination across multiple countries and institutions. Even after Koppin's investigation exposed the fraudulent nature of the claims, ensuring that accurate information reached all the audiences that had been exposed to the false narrative presented significant challenges. The speed and reach of initial false information distribution typically far exceed the capacity of correction efforts, creating lasting impacts that can persist long after definitive debunking has occurred. This asymmetry between false narrative propagation and truth verification represents a fundamental challenge for maintaining accurate public understanding of complex international issues. The final stages of McKay Koppin's investigation presented him with the challenging task of confronting Mao directly with the overwhelming evidence of his elaborate deception. After months of painstaking research, document analysis, and interviews with dozens of individuals across multiple countries, the journalist had assembled a comprehensive picture of fraud that extended far beyond anything he had initially suspected when he first agreed to investigate the extraordinary cartel tournament claims. The confrontation itself was arranged carefully, with Koppins ensuring that appropriate security and legal precautions were in place. Given the sophistication of Mao's previous deceptions and the substantial financial stakes involved, there were legitimate concerns about how he might respond when presented with definitive evidence of his fraudulent activities. Mao claimed that while some details of his story might have been embellished or confused due to psychological trauma, the core elements of his cartel captivity and tournament participation remained true. He insisted that the financial inconsistencies could be explained by activities that cartels had conducted using his identity without his knowledge, and that the timeline discrepancies resulted from his confused memory of traumatic events. However, as Koppins methodically presented each piece of evidence and demonstrated how the various elements of the deception interconnected, Mao's explanations became increasingly strained and contradictory. The sophistication and consistency of the fraudulent activities made it impossible to attribute them to confusion, trauma, or external manipulation by others. The confrontation revealed aspects of Mao's psychology that had not been apparent during earlier interactions. When his elaborate narrative structure began to collapse under scrutiny, he demonstrated remarkable emotional resilience and adaptability, quickly shifting from defensive explanations to various alternative approaches for managing the situation. At different points during the confrontation, Mao attempted to reframe himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, as someone whose initial small exaggerations had grown beyond his ability to manage, and as an individual who had been trying to expose real problems with cartel violence even if his specific story was not entirely accurate. These rapid shifts in self-presentation demonstrated the same psychological flexibility that had enabled his original deception. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that even while being confronted with definitive proof of his fraud, Mao was simultaneously attempting to develop new false narratives that might provide alternative explanations for his activities or create new opportunities for avoiding full accountability. His approach suggested that deception had become so integral to his thinking that abandoning it entirely was difficult even when maintaining it was clearly counterproductive. The confrontation also revealed the extent to which Mao had convinced himself of elements of his own false narrative. While he eventually acknowledged that the specific claims about cartel tournaments were fabricated, he continued to insist that he had experienced some form of trauma in Mexico that justified the emotional distress he had displayed during various presentations of his story. This partial self-deception created additional complexity for understanding both his motivations and his legal culpability. Individuals who have convinced themselves of their own lies present particular challenges for legal systems designed to distinguish between intentional fraud and mistaken belief. As news of Coppin's investigation began to reach the various individuals and organizations that had been deceived by Mao, the reactions varied significantly depending on each victim's particular circumstances and relationship to the fraudulent narrative. The human rights organization faced the particularly difficult challenge of acknowledging publicly that they had been systematically deceived while maintaining credibility for their other work. For an organization whose effectiveness depended on their reputation for careful investigation and accurate reporting, admitting to have been fooled by sophisticated fraud created institutional challenges that extended far beyond the immediate financial losses they had suffered. They faced the prospect of increased skepticism about their other work and potential difficulty in securing future funding and partnerships. The entertainment industry. Professionals who had been deceived faced different but equally significant challenges. The filmmaker who had originally approached Coppins with Mao's story had already invested substantial development resources and had made preliminary commitments to other industry partners based on what they believed was exclusive access to extraordinary intellectual property. The exposure of the fraud meant not only direct financial losses but also potential damage to professional relationships and reputation within an industry where judgment about story selection is considered a crucial professional skill. The filmmaker faced the uncomfortable prospect of explaining to investors and partners how they had been deceived by such elaborate fabrication. Individual investors who had provided funding for various aspects of Mao's story development faced the dual challenge of financial loss and personal embarrassment. Several had made their investment decisions based partly on their belief that they were supporting a genuine trauma survivor, making the discovery of fraud particularly emotionally difficult. The legal implications of Mao's activities were complex and would likely require coordination between multiple jurisdictions where different aspects of the fraud had occurred. The international nature of his deceptive activities, combined with the sophisticated financial structures he had created, meant that prosecuting the case would require substantial resources and expertise in international fraud investigation. Law enforcement officials indicated that while the evidence of fraud was compelling, the complexity of the case and the international coordination required would make prosecution challenging and time-consuming. The various victims would need to coordinate their efforts to maximize the chances of successful legal action and asset recovery. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that Mao's sophisticated deception represented just one example of what might be a broader category of modern fraud that exploits the characteristics of contemporary information and media environments. The success of his approach suggested that similar techniques might be employed by other individuals or organizations with even more sophisticated resources and strategic objectives. As McKay Coppins prepared to publish his comprehensive investigation into Mao's elaborate deception, he found himself grappling with questions that extended far beyond the specific case he had uncovered. The story represented more than just sophisticated fraud, it revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in how modern institutions, media organizations, and individuals navigate truth and deception in an era of unprecedented information complexity and global connectivity. The case highlighted critical weaknesses in verification procedures across multiple types of organizations that deal with extraordinary claims. Traditional journalistic fact-checking methods, designed for conventional stories with accessible sources and documentation, had proven inadequate for detecting sophisticated deception that exploited the inherent limitations of investigating secretive criminal activities. Human rights organizations faced similar challenges in their established procedures for documenting abuse and supporting victims. Their institutional commitment to believing and supporting trauma survivors, while essential to their mission, had been systematically exploited by someone who understood exactly how to present false information in ways that would resonate with their values and priorities. The entertainment industry's vulnerability to Mao's deception revealed how commercial pressures and competitive dynamics could compromise critical evaluation of extraordinary claims. The dramatic appeal of his narrative had been so compelling that basic questions about plausibility and verifiability had been set aside in favor of securing what appeared to be valuable intellectual property. For academic researchers and policy analysts studying organized crime, the case demonstrated how false information could potentially influence scholarly understanding and policy recommendations. If Mao's fabricated narrative had achieved broader academic credibility, it might have affected how researchers approached questions about cartel evolution and operational methods. The investigation revealed that modern information environments create unprecedented opportunities for sophisticated deception while simultaneously making verification more challenging. The speed at which information can spread globally, combined with the practical limitations most organizations face in conducting thorough verification, creates windows of opportunity that skilled fraudsters can exploit before adequate fact-checking occurs. Social media and digital communication technologies had enabled Mao to create and maintain false identities and fabricated supporting documentation with minimal resources but maximum impact. The democratization of content creation and distribution tools, while offering many benefits, also provide sophisticated fraudsters with capabilities that were previously available only to well-resourced organizations. The psychological sophistication of Mao's approach revealed how modern deception has evolved beyond simple lies to incorporate advanced understanding of human psychology, institutional behavior, and decision-making processes. His success required not just creating false information, but understanding how different audiences would process, evaluate, and act upon that information. The case underscored the importance of developing new approaches to verification and information sharing that account for the increased sophistication of modern deception. Organizations dealing with extraordinary claims need enhanced procedures that can detect sophisticated fraud while maintaining appropriate sensitivity to genuine victims and legitimate security concerns. Cross-institutional communication and coordination emerged as crucial factors in preventing sophisticated deception. Mao's success had been facilitated partly by the compartmentalization between different organizations and individuals he was deceiving, which prevented comprehensive pattern recognition that might have exposed his activities earlier. The investigation suggested that professional networks need better mechanisms for sharing concerns about potentially fraudulent individuals without violating appropriate legal and ethical constraints. While protecting privacy and avoiding unfounded accusations remains important, the current systems may inadequately protect against sophisticated fraudsters who move between different institutional contexts. For journalism, the case highlighted evolving challenges in investigating claims that involve inherently secretive activities and limited verifiable evidence. Traditional fact-checking methods, while still essential, may need to be supplemented with new approaches that can detect sophisticated deception designed specifically to exploit conventional verification limitations. The international dimensions of the case revealed how global connectivity creates both opportunities and vulnerabilities for information verification. While international communication enables broader fact-checking and source verification, it also allows sophisticated fraudsters to operate across multiple jurisdictions and exploit differences in institutional procedures and legal frameworks. The psychological impact on victims demonstrated how sophisticated deception affects not just financial and professional interests, but also fundamental trust in institutions and information sources. When elaborate frauds are exposed, they can create lasting cynicism that makes it more difficult for genuine stories to be believed and supported. This erosion of institutional trust represents one of the most serious long-term consequences of sophisticated deception. If audiences become overly skeptical of extraordinary claims due to exposure to high-profile fraud cases, real victims of genuine abuse may face increased difficulty in having their experiences recognized and addressed. The case also revealed how sophisticated fraud can exploit legitimate social values and institutional missions. Mao's success depended partly on his ability to present his false narrative in ways that aligned with genuine concerns about human rights, social justice, and the need to support trauma survivors. This exploitation of positive values creates particular challenges for organizations and individuals committed to these principles. Maintaining appropriate skepticism while preserving necessary openness to genuine victims requires developing more sophisticated approaches to evaluation and verification. The educational implications of the case extended beyond the specific organizations that had been directly deceived. The story provided a comprehensive example of how modern sophisticated fraud operates, offering valuable lessons for anyone involved in evaluating extraordinary claims or managing information in professional contexts. Media literacy and critical thinking education emerged as increasingly important tools for helping individuals and organizations navigate contemporary information environments. Understanding how sophisticated deception works can help potential victims recognize warning signs and ask appropriate questions before making commitments based on extraordinary claims. The case ultimately demonstrated that protecting against sophisticated deception requires not just better procedures and technologies, but also enhanced understanding of human psychology, institutional vulnerabilities, and the evolving nature of information manipulation in globalized environments. As Coppens concluded his investigation, he recognized that Mao's story would serve as more than just an exposé of individual fraud, it would stand as a cautionary tale about the challenges of maintaining truth and trust in an era of unprecedented information complexity and sophisticated deception capabilities. As we reach the end of this extraordinary investigation, we find ourselves confronting uncomfortable truths about the world we inhabit, a world where sophisticated deception can flourish in the spaces between our institutions, exploiting the very values and procedures designed to protect truth and support those in need. The story of Mao's elaborate fraud serves as a mirror, reflecting not only the capacity for human deception but also our collective vulnerabilities in an age of information abundance and institutional complexity. We have witnessed how the most well-intentioned organizations can become unwitting partners in deception, how professional expertise can be manipulated, and how our natural empathy for victims can be systematically exploited. Yet perhaps the most sobering lesson from this case is not about the existence of sophisticated fraud, but about what it reveals regarding our shared responsibility for maintaining truth in a complex world. Every individual and institution that encountered Mao's story faced choices about how thoroughly to investigate, how much to trust, and when to raise difficult questions that might challenge compelling narratives. The investigation reminds us that in our interconnected global society, the consequences of deception extend far beyond immediate victims to touch policy decisions, resource allocation, and public understanding of crucial issues. When false narratives achieve credibility and influence, they can distort our collective response to genuine challenges and undermine trust in the institutions we depend upon for truth and justice. As you settle into rest tonight, consider how this story illuminates the delicate balance we must maintain between appropriate skepticism and necessary openness, between protecting ourselves from deception and preserving our capacity to believe and support those who genuinely need our help. In the quiet darkness, we are reminded that truth remains both precious and fragile, requiring our constant vigilance and care to preserve and protect. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?